Hello, welcome to Cap Times Talks, a podcast bringing you smart conversations about big topics in our city. On today's show, should high schools be in the sports business? There's no doubt that Wisconsin communities are passionate about high school athletics. Earlier this week, Cap Times news editor Jason Joyce led a discussion at Memorial High School, sponsored by Home Savings Bank, about the role sports play in schools in 2018. The conversation touched on things like the spirit of competition, research on the medical consequences of play, and whether high school sports reflect the values of our broader community. The panel featured David Bell, director of the Wisconsin Injury in Sport Laboratory.
The number one reason why kids play sports is because it's fun, right? And the number one reason why kids drop out of sport is because it's not fun anymore.
Alex Mundy, the coach of the West High School girls' Ultimate Frisbee Club team.
Ultimate is one of those communities that you can play when you're 6 and you can play when you're 60.
Eric Bertrand, the Big 8 High School Conference Commissioner and the Director of Operations for the Capital East Soccer Club.
When it comes to officials, types of derogatory comments they are subject to at times, it's sort of indicative of how our society has become more hostile and less tolerant of people in general.
Will Green, the co-founder of Mentoring Positives and the La Follette High School girls basketball coach.
Whatever we do in this world comes down to relationships, right? How do you build those relationships?
And Jeremy Schlitz, athletic director for the Madison Metropolitan School District.
No longer does the society value the role player. It values the superstar much too much and success much too much, so no longer do people want to play for the love of the game.
Okay, let's dive in. We'll start with Will Green fielding a question about how he handles the expectations of parents as a coach. I hope you enjoy the talk.
You know, I run a mentoring program outside of the basketball coaching job that I have, and so when I knew I was taking this job, I was equipped to deal with parents because I've always dealt with pretty high range parents that oftentimes would come to their kids' rescue, not in the most positive way, right? They like to support their kid, but it's not in the most positive way. So I just prepare myself and try to proact and give kids the opportunity to not fall in the trap of, why didn't they get to play so many minutes? I oftentimes challenge them to see how did they prepare themselves for this opportunity. So, and I think you got to give parents the opportunity to come and meet with you and have an open communication to talk with them. So my door's always open, no matter what the situation is. We as coaches deal with a lot of tough situations. People wouldn't understand that I dealt with some type of issue before every game this year outside of basketball, and you got to keep a straight face and keep going. And so it's a joy though, man. I just love working with kids and families. So
Alex, you're coaching an alternative sport, and so unlike Coach Green, who has kids lined up to try out for that team every year, and they've been playing the game since they were 8 or 9 years old. What attracts athletes to your program at West, and who are you getting to come out for the team?
That is a great question. We do have a little bit more of an alternative sport, like you say, but we get athletes that range from ex-soccer players to swimmers to volleyball players, and yeah, kind of across the board. But we draw them in because of the team, and it's really, I do my due diligence as the coach, but it's really the girls and the atmosphere that we create that brings them in. Our captains are fabulous. They do all of our recruiting. Our girls, during the school year, have spirit days. We play exposition games, do all kinds of things to really just build the morale of the team, so that the girls are kind of spreading the word about how awesome the team is, how inclusive it is. We don't cut any of our girls who come out to play. If you come out to play with us, you are welcome on the team, no matter what skill level you have. I think that's another thing that draws our athletes too, is that it's not, it is a very athletic and competitive game, but even if you can't maybe run as fast as the top athlete, you are still given playing time and get to come out and train. So yeah, I think those are some of the biggest aspects.
I know a little bit about your program, but could you explain a little bit about sort of the commitment level? Again, you're working outside of the traditional varsity 3-sport, 3-season structure. So what does a school year look like for an ultimate player at West?
I would actually slightly disagree with that statement. We practice all year round. So we are really a full year sport. We have our captains start captain's practices early fall, and then we train inside in the winter, and then our regular game season is in the spring. Yeah, they practice all year long, and
they're playing games, league games during the week, and then traveling to tournaments in some cases, right?
Yep. And I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
No, I was I'm not sure how many of our audience understands like what a high school ultimate team looks like. We know, football teams play on Friday nights under the lights in the big stadium, but like, where do the ultimate kids play, and what does their competition look like?
Yeah. So we practice 4 to 5 days a week. We start going to tournaments even in the fall. They're a little bit more relaxed and just kind of building skill level in the fall. Then we usually travel to about 4 tournaments in the spring. One of them is here. We just had the mud bath tournament actually here at Memorial. It was a great turnout. And then, we travel to Illinois. We go to Minnesota and Iowa. And then we'll be doing our second year at the Nationals tournament this June.
Eric, as the commissioner of the Big Eight, can you just explain a little bit about sort of what your job is and what it entails and how you interact with the athletes and the coaches?
Sure. Well, primarily I'm the assigner for all varsity athletics for officials. I also make the schedules for varsity and sub-varsity sports, the competitive sports, the traditional, the WIA sports. I'm not involved in ultimate or lacrosse. In a nutshell, that's it. The officials piece of it is huge, assigning officials.
So I guess dovetailing off of that, and also I'm aware that I believe you taught a soccer clinic for my son when he was 4 years old, and I know that you work the sidelines at Badger soccer games, so you really are involved with athletes in this community from the first experience that they have kicking a ball around to the height of their athletic career. So this is a big question, but do you believe our athletic programs reflect our community values?
Well, yes. I think athletics are a reflection of the community and the society, and certainly when it comes to officials and the types of derogatory comments they are subject to at times. It's sort of indicative of how our society has become more hostile and less tolerant of people in general. It's not just athletics. It's the world we're in today, and it's not a new phenomenon. It's been progressing over the years. As far as so I think it is a reflection of the community, and there's some other key points as to why it is that way, just the societal part. But I'll add to that. I think parents have expectations, and maybe I'm going off track a little bit.
Oh, this is fine. Yeah.
With club sports, there's pay-to-play models, and you'll probably get into this a little bit, but parents and kids experience one sort of set of parameters in a pay-to-play environment, and then when they transition to a high school environment, it may or may not be equivalent. It may be better. It may be worse. That doesn't necessarily change the expectations that people have. High demands on their coaches, high demands on the officials, and so that adds to some of the stressors that are involved with high school participation.
I think that's a question I'd like to throw open to anyone who's interested in answering. From your perspective, seeing the way athletes interact with each other, probably primarily, but also with officials, coaches, parents, that whole sort of sports ecosystem. Do you think athletics reflect our community, reflect our society?
I could jump in. I mean,
at this
I think,
point in 2018?
Obviously, the saying "life imitates art," I think holds true here with athletics as well. And our goal is really to make our athletic programs reflective of our schools, and that's a positive way to look at it. I think sometimes we look at that as athletics being reflective of society in a negative way, and it doesn't have to be that way. I think we can celebrate the successes, the diversity, the uniqueness, the participation, and all those things through education-based athletics. I don't think that necessarily, to piggyback on Eric's comment, is true in club sports. Anytime you're paying somebody for an experience, I devalue it from an education-based athletic standpoint. I hope to find a way to support our school-based athletics to give them the experience that they need to grow as individuals and as athletes, where we wouldn't need to have that pay-to-play type atmosphere, which I think sometimes drives the negatives, and we try to celebrate the positives, obviously.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that one? I just remember, I remember very few quotations from Bo Ryan, but I remember this one when people were sort of hammering him on, this was before he had gotten to a Final Four, and they were sort of hammering him on his lack of success in the NCAA tournament. And he said, winning trophies is great, but chasing trophies is pretty fun. Do you get that impression from the athletes that you're dealing with, that they enjoy the journey as much as the championship or as much as the W every time? Coach Green?
I think about the different venues, right? It's about the school and the atmosphere, where they come from. You have a winning culture or winning tradition, then yeah, it's fun. If you don't come from a space where you don't win that much, maybe not necessarily that fun. And I find myself in that space as people in the community tell me La Follette is called laugh a lot. And, we changing the culture. So, I've been in sports all my life, and it's like Jeremy said, it's like, I think, we model what we see, right? It's like a child in the home. So if your parent is in the home and it's a negative atmosphere, you're more than likely going to find that negativity. So like you said, we're trying to create a positive atmosphere. It's my job as a coach to impose positivity in your most trying times, right? And so your team is going to pretty much, kind of transpire what you give them. And so, man, chasing W's is fun, especially when you can create a culture where you are kind of grabbing that team and bringing it home. And so, it's tough. It's tough out here. It really is, because if you think about the 4 city schools, it's very different for us when you have to go out to a Middleton or Verona or Sun Prairie, right? I got kids that go and look at those facilities and those spaces and be like, whoa, like, that stuff really shows that you care about a kid and you care about a program. And so, we have to really grab our kids and really, give them that positivity. And you have to cheerlead these kids a lot, man. You really have to put a lot of time and effort into, creating that positive spirits.
That's great. I definitely want to get back to that. David?
Yeah, so just a couple things. One is that the research shows that the number one reason why kids play sports is because it's fun, right? And the number one reason why kids drop out of sport is because it's not fun anymore. And so just kind of keep that in the back of your mind, right? That's one of the reasons why a lot of kids drop out. But I think also that what might kind of get to your question about, what are we doing right in high schools and sports, and how does that reflect our values? We surveyed about 1,000 parents recently and asked them, how much do you spend on your kids' high school sports and how much do you spend on your kids' club sports? And the average that people were spending on their kids' high school sports was probably about $250. And then the average that they're spending on their kids' club sports, it was closer to $2,000, $2,500. And with many parents reporting to us that they easily spend $10,000 per sport per kid per year. And so, I don't think that's the kind of values that we want to reflect. I mean, there are certainly problems in high school sports, but I think that's one of the great things is that there's a really low cost of entry, and so that makes it much more accessible to a lot of kids that might not be able to pay those club sport fees. And so if we're getting into this pay for play model, then I think that's a problem, right? Because now we're not going to be able to, we're shutting kids out of that system rather than embracing them into it.
Alex, I'd like to explore a little bit with you about how Ultimate works, and in particular the fact that Ultimate at the high school level as well as up to the highest levels of the sport is not officiated. And there are a lot of sort of values that are built into that. And I believe players take that pretty seriously. First of all, I guess, are your players pretty receptive to that way of running a sport? And second, I guess, what do you hear from players who are coming from other sports and trying to adapt to that?
Great questions. So we have what's called Spirit of the Game in Ultimate Frisbee, and it's where our players self-officiate on the field. So they are required to learn the rules and call their own fouls. Across the board, they act as their own refs on the field, and they usually love it because what it fosters is this community of communication just within the sport, where if a foul is called, play stops, they will talk it out. As the player who calls the foul, you get to talk about why you called it. The player who potentially did the foul gets to explain whether or not they think it was a foul or not. And you can have open disagreements. If it's a contested foul, then the disc goes back so that neither the offense nor the defense gains any kind of benefit, but play goes on. And it's one of the biggest things that I love about the sport. And especially with being on the sidelines as the coach, we actually are not allowed to make any kind of comments when a foul is called. So we have to just let our players talk it out. They might make the wrong call, they might make the right call, but it's something we can talk about when they come off the field. But players love having that responsibility, and it really kind of fosters that sense of just sportsmanship within our sport. And coming from other sports, it's very interesting to see the different opinions about it. I know when I was growing up, I played soccer and then moved on to Ultimate. And in soccer, where it's officiated by refs, your attitude is kind of, you're going to be as physical as you can until the ref calls it. But within Ultimate, you really have to be on your own, playing on your own terms in terms of making sure you're not fouling other players, because someone on the field is going to call it, and when they do, you have to own what happened, and it's not up to a ref to kind of figure it out. So you're held to, I think, a higher standard, I would say, in that respect.
David, I wanted to talk to you about a particular aspect of high school sports, which I think a lot of people are talking about, and that's football. And the question that I've sort of battered around, I played a little bit of high school football, and a lot of my friends did as well. Will there still be high school football in 20 years, do you think?
Yeah, so I'm assuming you're kind of alluding to the concussion issues, right?
Sure.
There, as well as maybe some of the other safety issues. So I think that, I have a little bit of background with concussion, so I can speak to this a little bit. I'm certainly not an expert in concussion, but there are, I think some of probably the way that a lot of medical practitioners are thinking about this is that, so obviously CTE is something that's gotten a lot of attention, right? Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is a tau disposition in the brain associated with repetitive hits to the head. And we're not really sure if it's driven by just the actual numbers of concussions that people have, or if it's these subconcussive blows, for example, that a lineman would get hit multiple times or have hundreds of hits over the course of a season, if that would be associated with this buildup of this protein that's called tau that's in the brain. And so the question is, how is that going to change football? Well, football's already changing for sure, and I think there are going to be some more rule changes that are going to limit how people play the game. And I think overall that these things are probably good for the long-term health of the athlete. I will say that there is a camp out there that kind of thinks that if this was such a big deal, right, why don't we have a bunch of 45-year-old, 50-year-old individuals who are walking around with dementia, for example, which is kind of a precursor to that kind of brain disease. And so, yeah, I think that, but we're also, for good or bad, we're getting better at building athletes, right? We are bigger, faster, stronger nowadays than we were several years ago. So I think that's kind of not a clearly understood factor of how that's going to kind of factor into everything. So yeah, so that's a great question. And unfortunately, the academic answer is it depends, right? We don't know, but we think that we know that the things that are happening nowadays are, for example, the WIAA implementing rules where only going down to one practice game, or limiting the number of hits that people can sustain during the year. Those are all good things for player health over the long term. And so as long as they're done judiciously and they're done with evidence rather than with, just kind of, word of mouth or kind of belief, then I think that's probably a good thing for the game. So I think there's still going to be football. I don't know what it'll look like. It might be a little bit different, though.
Eric, from your perspective, dealing with officials, hiring officials, training officials, how much chatter goes on about the new rules of football, or just what needs to be maybe whistled now that wasn't a generation ago?
Officials obviously are being given some guidance from the National Federation and the WIA as far as rule changes, things like that. I believe many of the officials in the sport of football are of a certain generation. They go back to the old school. So I think there's a learning curve for adjusting to the new rules and the safety measures, I think. But I think pretty sure that everyone's conscious that safety has to be given higher consideration than maybe it was even a decade ago.
Jeremy, at the school side of that, how engaged in a discussion about what football
I think,
might end
we're
up
very
looking like?
lucky being where we are in terms of having resources like at the UW, whether it's Dr. Ballard or Dr. McGuine or whoever might be doing some studies that actually focus on our athletes and are extrapolated to the national component. But also this goes to all of our contact sports, whether it be football or soccer or wrestling or hockey or the myriad of ones where we kind of have that interaction. We're in a great spot. The WI has been proactive with some concussion insurance to make sure everybody can be comfortable that they're receiving appropriate medical attention if they do have concerns. We're really on the front edge of that in this state and in this area. So I think the discussion's ongoing. It's always in the back of the mind, but I think what we're doing is finding best practice, just like we would in all of our sports, and making sure we're doing things with intention before we make a drastic change in anything.
Tell me a little bit about participation. Has participation been affected by the discussion about football
it varies
safety
from school to school, even whether we're talking about just the Madison schools or the area ones. And I think a lot of it comes down to not only with coaches being able to recruit, train, and retain them, but to also do the same thing for players and parents. Can we recruit players and parents, whether it's football or any other sport? Can we train them to do it properly, safely, and understand it? And do they want to stay back and do it, like Coach said, because it's fun? And we were building the community around it. And we have not seen drastic drop in participation either at the high school or youth levels. In fact, a couple of our schools have actually increased numbers in football recently.
This is just anecdotal, but I thought I saw the Pop Warner participation was down about 20% in Madison and kind of across the board. Is that?
Yeah, there's a couple different leagues now, so that's what differentiates it.
Okay.
And you've got a couple of youth organizations playing flag a little longer.
Gotcha.
So numbers-wise, it just kind of depends. High school numbers have actually increased,
Yeah.
which is a little bit of an anomaly for Madison compared to some of our other surrounding areas right now. But a lot of that is kind of what I think I fell back on is we are kind of on the front edge of this and educating people about, what's going on and how we can best approach it.
Yeah, that's an interesting trend too, because I think the National Federation data, high schools, supports that high school sport participation has actually increased over time. But that's kind of juxtaposed to youth sport participation, which has shown that in a lot of those youth sports, before you get to high school, those participation rates are actually dropping. It's sport specific. So for example, in some of our traditional sports like soccer, that might be going down. But in other sports, for example, like lacrosse has seen a huge increase in the number of sport participation rates. So it's a kind of a mixed bag. But
If there are parents here, they might agree with me on this. Like lacrosse eats other sports. Like kids just start playing lacrosse and then they stop playing everything else. I think it's like one of those cultural kinds of things. Eric, you mentioned how a lot of your officials who work football games are of the old school, and that brings me to a question about recruiting officials. We see the commercials from the WIAA during tournaments. We hear about it on a national angle that it's tough to recruit officials. Are you seeing that locally, and why do you think that might be?
Well, I think it definitely depends on the sport. If you're a gymnastics judge, you can pretty much write your own ticket and judge meets every night there is a meet. If you're a basketball official, we have an abundance of officials in basketball, so it varies by sport. But in general, I'd say the recruiting, it's not trending in the right direction, the number of officials across the board. And I'd say there's multiple factors involved. Officials are aging out and not being replaced at the numbers that they're aging out. The economy, believe it or not, when the economy's doing well, officials maybe don't need that extra $50 as much as they did when they were laid off from a job. And then there's the generational aspect, which my kids are part of, so I can feel free to snipe at them a little bit. But in the old days, it was a commitment to sort of work your way up, work freshman, JV, and varsity. And maybe nowadays that's not necessarily the case with younger officials. They want to go right to the top. You've probably heard that in other aspects too of life. But just no one's getting rich to be as an official, whether it's $40 or $60 or $100. Some officials just choose to do other things with their time. So I don't think there's an increase in any sport. There may be some pockets here and there, but there's concern that the numbers are not matching, especially as participation numbers go up.
I'm starting to get to some questions here from the audience, and I have a number of reactions to Coach Green's remarks about how, when you take your teams to the Middletons or the Sun Prairies, I mean, these are schools that don't just have, some fancy athletic facilities. They have straight up fancy schools. Sun Prairie is an amazing facility. Jeremy, maybe you can talk a little bit about sort of the economics of how programs like Sun Prairie's can build an artificial turf baseball stadium and perhaps a competitive disadvantage.
I think the only disadvantage we're really working with is the lack of the abundance of land to replicate some of the things that they're doing. They voted yes on referendums. So those of you Madison voters out there, whenever you see one, I encourage you to vote yes. Whatever it's for, if we can support education, that's a good thing. But I think the other thing that we're starting to capitalize on as a necessary thing is finding partnerships and sponsorships to help maybe support some of these things, not only for the school, not only for extracurriculars, but part of the curriculum, but also for the community to be able to access and use. And that's some of the models that happened in Sun Prairie. And as you look at the referendum in Verona and some of those things as they come up, we've made some really great gains with our athletic facilities here in the last few years in terms of upgrading some facilities. We've got a schedule and a long-term plan to kind of address some of our concerns. We just recently did an assessment to kind of recognize what we need to do, and we're able to kind of put a triage in there with it. And I'm encouraged that we're going to be able to stay storied in the tradition that we have. I think, you say Sun Prairie is a beautiful building. I'd argue East is a beautiful building, and we can find a way to really, celebrate the tradition that we have. Madison as a whole have the top 2 schools that have the most state championships in the state of Wisconsin. We have storied tradition here, and I think celebrating it and staying rooted in our past is really important, and just finding ways to make sure we're intentional about finding safe and appropriate facilities. I think a nice small gym that people can be there is a great place to watch a game, as opposed to maybe a large field house. Or, I think having the intimacy that we have with some of the things that were built, whether that was 50 or 60 years ago or 100 years ago, and finding ways to better repurpose them is a great thing to celebrate too.
I would agree. I'd rather watch a basketball game at East High School, I think, than just about anywhere else. Talking a little bit about maybe an underappreciated byproduct of playing athletics in high school is learning how to exercise, developing a true love of kind of keeping yourself physically fit, and appreciating competition going forward into adulthood. Do you think schools do a good job of sort of nourishing just a love of fitness and of keeping yourself healthy, into adulthood? Anybody who wants to take that?
I think that's why we see the rise in our participation numbers in things like cross country and swimming and some of our fitness-based sports. Obviously, Madison, whether it's the CrossFit Games or the Ironman or all the different races and activities that we celebrate as a community, that plays into what we're seeing as our athletes' participation too. But with our participation rate, over half of our students come through as high school athletes. Obviously, we want them to develop some lifetime interest and passion for it, and hopefully they can give back as officials or come back and do studies and help us make the better athlete or participate and learn from that. But I really do think we're doing a nice job of giving everybody an opportunity to learn how to be fit and learn why it's valuable and to find a fun way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Alex, the game you coach is a game that is for a lifetime. I shared earlier I'm missing my Spring League Ultimate game tonight, and that's a sport that I never played as a kid. Do your athletes talk about that? They want to move on with this sport, something that they want to play into adulthood?
Yeah, definitely. Ultimate is one of those communities that you can play when you're 6 and you can play when you're 60. And especially in Madison, we just have such a big rec league as well as kind of that elite scene that anyone can play at any level. I've seen my high schoolers and our program just grow because of that. And my girl's kind of going off to college and being excited about that, and then being able to come back to Madison after college and playing as an adult. Yeah, it's really.
Again, I think perhaps there are more people here who know about Ultimate than I'm guessing, but you have athletes who pick colleges based on how good the Ultimate team is there, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Especially in the Midwest, the college scene is flourishing, whether it's playing men's, women's, or mixed. Our athletes are loving it. Mm-hmm.
Will, do you still play basketball?
I do. My knees are a little bit sore from all the concrete. That's one thing we don't see a lot. I come from Gary, Indiana, and I used to, me and my friends would get in a car and drive around to find every court where we can take our 5 and get after people. And I see a lot of basketball courts in Madison empty without that. And, all it takes is that one ball to get people to go play. And so, I think kids staying healthy it's about the relationship of the coach too, in this sport. Just for instance, track. I see a lot of girls. A lot of my players are out, and you got to stay pretty in shape to do that. And so they're always striving for that personal best and trying to beat that next time. And so I think it comes down to a lot of whatever we do in this world. It comes down to relationships, right? How do you build those relationships? And your athletes can trust. You need to go to sleep. You need to not burn the candle at both ends of the stick. You need to get some sleep, and you need to eat right. So it's all about personal relationship, I think, too, when it comes to the coach and the athlete.
I wanted to go right back to you in talking about club sports and AAU, because basketball perhaps is the sport that we think of the most when we think about the effect that AAU has had. Are kids who are really active in AAU and who are really trying to get that Division I scholarship, are their goals at odds with your goals as a coach of a varsity high school team? Are they stepping out on their teammates at that point? Tell us about the challenges of dealing with that.
It's definitely a challenge. If a kid on the basketball team is not, getting fulfilled with what they want on the basketball court from the high school team, they often will go to the AAU and use that space as their sanctuary to be like, this is better than the high school team. I've had kids that go through the whole season, a senior that used the AAU circuit, and I had no discussions with the college coach, and they facilitated that all through their AAU, career. And so it's definitely a challenge, man. It's definitely a challenge because a lot of kids often the pay-to-play comes into play, and that ultimately translates into high school. And then when it don't work in that way, it can create a negative culture. So, there's some good AAU programs out there. There's some good coaches. I'm all about fundamentals, and I think AAU sometimes miss that. A lot of kids just play games instead of working on their fundamentals and what they need to go back to the high school level and be successful. So it's a challenge, man. It's a challenge, and we're gonna deal with that beast for a long time to come. So,
Eric, you can maybe talk about this from the soccer perspective, because clubs are every bit as influential in the soccer world, right?
Yes. I know you're a soccer fan, Jason. Around the world, soccer is the sport of the masses. In this country, in many parts of the country, it's an upper middle class sport, just by its nature, the pay-to-play model. I was just reading some information from a handout that came through the Georgia State High School Athletic Association, was co-authored by Bob Gardner from the NFHS, that talks about the whole scholarship, the Holy Grail, the D1 scholarship. Less than 2% of high school athletes ever get any level of a D1 scholarship, and the average is across the nation is about $10,000, which is, anybody that has kids in college know that's not going to cover a tremendous amount. But again, I earlier was mentioning the expectations about chasing that dream of a college scholarship, and the money spent to get to that point, in many cases, could be used more wisely. Another number that was jumped out was there's about $3 billion in athletic scholarship monies, that there's $11 billion in academic scholarship money. So there's other ways that kids can figure out how to play to get to college, but there's a lot of prestige and a lot of notoriety by saying, I got a scholarship, an athletic scholarship. So I think that drives a lot of the pay-to-play model, certainly for the parents that can get the checkbooks out and write the checks. Yeah.
That segues nicely into a question I have here. Someone wants us to discuss the important connection between students participating in athletics and academic achievement.
A couple years
Jeremy,
ago,
maybe
we did a pretty in-depth study for our district and kind of saw some of the differences matching alike students, and their one differentiator being if they participated in high school athletics or not. And the findings were pretty drastic in terms of increase in grade point average, decrease in attendance and behavior issues, and I think that the small one that focused in on our MMSD schools is reflective of all the data that we get to see come out through our national federation and celebrating the connection. And it is a chicken or egg question. Those that want to be connected to the school, if this is the way that they're connected, they stay connected. And there are many ways to do that, but I think this is the one that oftentimes is what grabs them. And I think the idea of having additional adult educators that are looking out for them as both a student and an athlete, the more people that we can put in support and advocacy for all of our students, adding a coach, adding a mentor, adding the assistant coach or the volunteer that does some tutoring because they built the relationship with the student or whatever it may be. That's really the biggest benefit. The metrics come out great. I think those metrics were almost staggering. I knew it was good, but when you saw the complete difference that when you match alike students and the one variable that changes was their participation in high school athletics and the dramatic change for the positive, it's really, hopefully that's the reward people like Will and Alex see as you're doing things that are making kids better students. The athletics is a byproduct of what we're really doing for the kids.
David, have you seen any research that reflects what Jeremy's talking about on a national level, on a wider level?
He's spot on, right? I think that is exactly what MSSD found is being reflected across the country, that there are just so many positives associated with athletic participation. Jumping back to your earlier comment too, I was just kind of thinking that, one of the things we have to be a little careful here is that in a place like Madison, you have a lot of opportunity outside of the school, and that's not going to be true across the state, right? Especially in rural communities, for example, where high school participation in athletics might be one of the only avenues where kids can actually go out and participate in athletics. And so I think that's even more important. We hear from parents a lot and from kids a lot, it's still a really big deal to make your high school team, and people want that, right? And when we go away from that, I think that's going to be a problem, right? If we're going to not offer baseball because it's cold in Wisconsin, right, and we're going to drive those kids off to participate in summer leagues and in club leagues, I think that would be a really sad thing to happen. I want to make sure that the kids have the opportunity to play sports, for their high school team, because it's still something that people hang on to for the rest of their lives.
Not only is the sports landscape changing, but the public education, sort of the traditional, 1,500 person city high school, that model in many places around the country is changing with the advent of charter schools and specialized schools. I guess we could start with Eric and sort of go down the row. Are there changes that you anticipate happening to high school sports in the next 10, 15, 20, even beyond that down the road?
Boy, I'm not sure I have a good answer for that. Don't have a crystal ball, but there's pressure on funding. When the referendums do come up in Madison, you can only ignore leaking roofs but so long and things like that. So there will have to be some ways, and there has been a lot of positives in Madison with benefactors and things like that to help support athletics, but it may continue to shift into a need for private funding to help support athletics, I would say, but hopefully the model of high school athletics stays pretty much on course.
David?
If it does change, I hope that it changes that in a way that more kids can play PE and participate in PE, and that programs don't get cut, and that if the facilities do, or the teams do go away, that maybe there's some way that all kids can use their facilities throughout the entire year, right, for example, so we can make sure the kids are being physically active. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon, right? But I think that PE on the chopping block is always something that's a potential threat. And to me, that's a really big deal, probably bigger than high school sports.
That was on my list of things to ask about, and I'm not sure that we'll have much time to explore this in depth, but when I was in high school, we had an active intramural program at my high school. I played on an intramural ice hockey team, which is, I think there were like 4 teams at my high school, and it was pretty competitive. What happened to intramurals? When did those go away? And why don't we have them anymore?
I think in our district we're lucky. We've got MSCR, who runs a lot of our adult sports that they're probably familiar with, do run some things in our middle schools and high schools. A lot of that's, again, based on staffing. Do we have the right person in the school to make that connection and make people want to do that? I think the other piece that goes with it is, unfortunately, video games and connecting socially without having to interact personally has really driven that. You can interact without ever having to be in physical proximity with people. And I'm not saying that's all negative, but I think that does drive us away from some of those gathering things, which were maybe intramural sports or, any of our after-school activities. Yet we still see, over 100 clubs at each one of our 4 schools, whether it be based upon sports or academics or debate or fine arts or things like that. So people still are thirsting for that interaction. So I think that may be some of it. And then intramural sports, it's the same reason we don't have people that want to come out and not be a star, which people have kind of related to, is no longer does the society value the role player as much as I think is extremely important. It values the superstar much too much and success much too much, so no longer do people want to play for the love of the game. I'm lucky enough that I don't really have a job. I get to get paid for the passion that I have, and I wish that for more people, and I think we've lost some of that, and that's why we lose some of those gathering spaces that used to be, in our generation, intramural sports, where now it is an online chat room as they play a video game or try to make a YouTube channel, which all their friends follow.
Alex, did you have any thoughts about changes to come? Will there be competitive ultimate teams in every school across the land?
I would hope so. I think the biggest thing that we are seeing right now is just kind of goes back to the facilities. Even just our own program. While West has an amazing athletics program, the lack of space is really what gets us. Because we're not a varsity sport, we kind of get last dibs on gym space, even though we are one of the biggest, if not the biggest, sports program at West, just with numbers of students who come out to play for our teams. And we win state titles, and we go to nationals. Just because of lack of space, it's tough, and so I think that's going to be one of the biggest changes.
I just wanted to say, we are dealing with kids, students, and so you have to cultivate these individuals. Sports is scary for some kids because they're not the star, and so if you don't have the self-confidence and the self-esteem to go out there and apply yourself, then you're going to have the lack of interest of kids getting involved in these sports anyway. So, and that's from an early age. So we have to cultivate that. And it takes the individuals to engage these students and these kids in these sports and, kind of bring that along. And that can be lost by the wayside. So we can't forget, it's pretty scary for students to be out there in front of people and doing these sports and cultivating that,
Coach, I cannot imagine, we're just at the end of our time here, but I cannot imagine what it feels like to be a 16-year-old kid trying to hit a free throw in front of a gym full of screaming 16-year-olds. It's the most amazing thing I've ever seen, and they do it over and over, don't they? Thank you to everyone on our panel for joining us for a great discussion tonight. Again, a podcast of this will be available. Thanks to all of you for coming out on a beautiful night to join us, and we hope to see you at a Cap Times Talk again very soon. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Cap Times Talks. We put these talks together about once a month or so. In the meantime, you can check out our other podcasts, including The Corner Table, The Cost of Opportunity, and another show brimming with great conversations, just like this one, called Live from Cap Times Idea Fest. Please subscribe to this show on iTunes or wherever you may find podcasts. I'm Eric Lawrenson, and thanks again for listening.